Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro about operating at non-towered airports, and we'll be discussing the FAA's new Advisory Circular AC 90-66C, which gives the latest procedures for non-towered airports. And we'll also be listening to an audio clip that occurred at the Watsonville, California airport when I was flying there last week. It's an interesting conversation between a Cessna 182 doing a long straight-in approach and an SR-22T that was flying in the pattern. And at the very end of the show, I'll tell you a little bit more about what happened. Last week in episode 287, we talked about the July 2021 crash of a Challenger jet that was doing a circling approach at the Truckee, California airport. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/287. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, in whatever app that you're using to listen to me, take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've ever learned something in the past that's helped make you a better pilot, think about what you might pay as CFI for an hour of flight instruction and make a donation to help support the show. To do that, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up to make a monthly donation, or to make a one-time donation, go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And of course, those links are in the episode description in the podcast app that you're listening to now. Now let me tell you a little about Catherine Cavagnaro. She's an expert on spins, aerobatics, and upset recovery, and owns a flight school called Ace Aerobatics School, located at the Suwannee-Franklin County Airport on the campus of the University of the South. In addition to holding ATP and CFI certificates, she's a professor of mathematics at the University of the South and has chaired the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. Catherine is the 2020 National CFI of the Year, and she also serves as a designated pilot examiner. And now here's our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro. Catherine, welcome back to the show. Always so wonderful to have you here with us.
Max, thanks for having me back. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Likewise. Well, you've written a couple of articles for AOPA Pilot Magazine about non-towered airports, one a year ago and one for the upcoming September issue. Tell us what prompted you to write that first article a year ago.
Sure, yeah. So I was giving a practical exam near the Winchester Airport in Southeast Tennessee, and we were up doing maneuvers, and I saw some aircraft all approaching the Winchester Airport. One of them had entered a 45 for the left downwind to 18 and was turning downwind. And another airplane was coming in on a straight final on an instrument approach, practice instrument approach to 18. And then I heard a third aircraft announce that he was on a right downwind for 18 and looking for traffic. And I could see on the ADS-B what I thought potentially could be a disaster unfolding. And I tried to be polite about it, but I keyed the mic and said, sir, Winchester has a left pattern. And he still said that, he was on right downwind looking for traffic. And then he started to turn base. And so you have these three aircraft all coming together to land on 18. And it turns out that they all landed within about a minute of each other. Fortunately, there was no accident or anything like that. But, that just worries me. And after we landed, I approached the pilot in the FBO and let him know that I had been the one to key the mic and mention that Winchester had a left pattern. And I tried to do so very calmly because I do know that when people get confrontational, that people stop listening. And I didn't want him to get defensive, but it turns out he got defensive anyway. And he said that, he wasn't even sure that Winchester had a left pattern. Of course, that's pretty easy to find out. When after that, he said that he was exercising his PAIC authority to enter on a right downwind because he thought that was the safest way to go. And, it was just sort of excuse after excuse. And I ended up reporting him to the FAA. The FAA has a hotline for that kind of incident. And I'm not sure whatever came of it, but, I found in recent years, Max, that I am more likely to at least do something. I felt like I couldn't get across to him how unsafe that kind of a pattern entry was. And that was just really disappointing. So I'm not sure whatever happened to it, but I'm hoping he at least got some counsel.
Well, I hope so as well. Let's talk about traffic patterns. Is it an option to fly the opposite flow pattern, or is that required? Now, we're not talking about helicopters and gyroplanes, which are often required to go the opposite flow. But what about airplanes? Is that at the pilot's discretion, or are they supposed to follow the standard flow?
It is absolutely not pilot discretion. When a left pattern, for example, has been set up for an airport, we need to make all turns to the left. So that is an FAA regulation.
Yeah, so pilots are in violation. I'm always surprised at the number of times that people will do that. I was at an airport, Tracy, recently, which has a lot of traffic from a nationwide flight school, and someone was making right traffic to 30, and I called them on it, and they came up with, some silly excuse. So, yeah, let's not do that. It's just absurd. Well, you mentioned that the second article, which is coming out here in the September magazine, what prompted you to write that article?
Well, there was a new advisory circular, or a new version of the advisory circular. It's now the C version, 9066C. And my sense is that followed, or that was at least the rewrite was prompted by the horrible accident last year at Watsonville, California, where you had Cessna 152 in the pattern, just doing some touch and goes in the pattern. And then you had a light twin coming in straight. And even though the two were communicating with each other, the light twin ran into the Cessna 152. There was a midair on the, that confluence where you have the left base traffic meeting the final traffic. Those two collided. And of course, it was a horrible accident. So my sense is that maybe prompted the rewrite of 9066. So I decided to go ahead and write an article on that again because it's just such important information, and I wanted to call pilots' attention to it.
And I'll just mention that we talked about that in detail in episode 243, the Watsonville midair. And funny you should mention that because I was at Watsonville literally 4 days ago, and I happened to be recording my flight. And the tail end of that flight, I heard a rather interesting conversation, so I went back afterwards to find the full audio. And let me go ahead and play that here, and let's take a listen to this conversation that happened at Watsonville just a couple of days ago.
Watsonville traffic calling Delta 7 Tango Whiskey 5 miles northeast, straight in for 20, full stop, Watsonville. Watsonville traffic calling Delta 7 Tango Whiskey 3 miles straight in for 20, full stop, Watsonville.
Watsonville traffic, 365 now, so turning left base, runway 20, straight in traffic, watch out. So traffic 65 now for a short final, runway 20, full stop, Watsonville.
Hey pilot, on the short final, I was 3 miles straight in and you cut me off.
Was 800 feet below you.
That's good to know, thank you for sharing.
Well, remarkably, this is almost exactly the same scenario that occurred with the midair collision last year. What would you say to either of these pilots?
Yeah, first of all, listening to that video is just chilling because of that similarity. So, I think both of these pilots need some counsel. One of the points of the advisory circular that has stayed constant is, the emphasis that pilots coming in straight in do not enjoy any sort of a priority for landing over pilots who are already established in the pattern. So just because you're coming in straight in, just because you're on an instrument approach of some sort, practice or real, you get no priority over someone who is already in the pattern. Clearly, the fellow who was already established in the pattern, had the right of way here. But I don't think that being snarky in a response on frequency, it was helping at all. So, there's a way for people to just, adjust their flying a little bit so that we can all, use the same traffic pattern, the same airport, and operate safely. I experience a lot giving practical exams. just that sort of cooperation, how it works. You know, we might be coming in straight and I realize that there's somebody about to turn base. And I might say something like, hey, we'll adjust our speed and we will follow you in, or we'll stay out of your way. Or that maybe that other person says, hey, we'll extend downwind a little bit, or we'll slow down a little bit and come in behind you. With that kind of spirit of cooperation, we can all use the same traffic pattern very safely. So it's just unfortunate that we have people like this who, just choose to shun safety. It's just sad.
Yeah, a couple of different thoughts. I totally agree with you. The person that was in the pattern clearly had the right of way. The pilot who was flying straight in somehow sounded a little entitled, even though the pilot in the pattern had actually kind of raised the fact that, hey, he was in the pattern. Watch out for me. There were so many things that could have been done differently. The manager of the Watsonville Airport is a longtime friend of mine. I've known him long before he became the manager of the airport. And he told me that after the midair last summer, that pilots got very cooperative, and if somebody was coming straight in, the person on downwind would offer to extend their base to follow, and people were just extremely courteous. He said that lasted for a few weeks, and then after that, it was kind of back to business as usual. So I think people's memories, unfortunately, are fairly short, and I've kind of wondered, why is it that pilots feel entitled about flying the long straight-in approach? It seems like, in this particular case, the pilot on final seemed to think, based on what she said, that she clearly had the right of way, which she did not. About the only thing I can come up with is the right on red traffic light laws here in the U.S. The person going straight has the right to go through the intersection. They can't be cut off by the person who's making, a right turn on red or a left turn or, things like that. And that's about the only analogy I can come up with, is maybe people are so used to driving cars straight through an intersection and having the right of way that they somehow feel that that's also the case in the air, which is absolutely wrong.
That's right. Yeah. I also wonder if it has to do with maybe when people get to fly faster aircraft, they feel like, okay, well, it's costing me more to operate mine. I should just be able to come in straight. I saw online recently a local pilot who was complaining. One of our local flight schools that's very busy has temporarily relocated because of some ramp work to an airport that's closer to me. And this local pilot was complaining because, you had these trainee aircraft who sort of refused to get out of his way when he came in straight. And, I think there's this mentality that the people in the pattern are maybe less experienced and they should get out of the way of the more experienced pilots, which of course that's not true.
And one thing that I've come to realize fairly recently is that when you've got a very fast, large airplane coming straight in, it really does make sense to let them come in, because if you don't, if you've got that fast King Air, you've got that light jet coming in, if you force them to follow the pattern because there's some kind of conflict, now they're going to be up in the air even longer, making all kinds of gyrations around the pattern.
Right.
It really is in everybody's interest for big, fast airplanes, get them in on the ground. So frankly, anytime I encounter those situations, boy, I just say, hey, we'll extend the downwind to follow. That just makes it so much easier for everyone.
Yeah, that's where generosity, spirit of cooperation help. I think if people have that, it's amazing what the other pilots, will do to accommodate. I think what worried me is the attitude was very similar to what I imagined the pilots of the clip you just played. It's that kind of entitlement that's what worries me.
Well, you mentioned in your article a flight that you had with Ben, who was a candidate for a commercial check ride that you were doing with him. Tell us about that.
Right. So I was giving a practical exam to Ben, and we were on the left downwind for, interestingly, Winchester Airport, again in Southeast Tennessee. And as we were turning on the downwind from the 45, we noticed an aircraft that was about 1,000 feet over the airport, and we saw it visually, and we also saw it on the traffic display. And so he turned downwind, and the next thing we knew is this plane was 500 feet above us now instead of 1,000, and had turned downwind behind us. And the two airplanes on the traffic display were almost on top of each other. And this pilot announced that he was also on a left downwind for 18. And so that was pretty concerning because basically he was descending on top of us. And Ben wisely chose to do a short approach. So the idea is hopefully the other airplane would extend farther and, we would increase the separation between us. To our surprise, the other pilot also turned base just after we did. And these two airplanes are on the screen are almost on top of each other. We couldn't see the aircraft because it was slightly behind us. And so Ben wisely chose to go around and so that we could land without the fear of an aircraft on our tail. But, that's just unsafe. So coming in straight can be problematic, but descending into a pattern, that is very dangerous. He entered on a crosswind for the pattern, which is fine, but he should have done it at pattern altitude and sequenced in a way that created a safe distance between the two aircraft.
Yes, and I see this quite frequently. I don't think people realize that one of the things that's discussed in this AC is that pilots are to be at traffic pattern altitude when they enter the pattern. And so I take that to mean, for example, if I'm inbound on the 45, when I'm probably 3 miles from the airport would be pretty close to about the latest time where I would like to be at the pattern altitude, right. Maybe 2 miles at the very, very, very latest. And yet I see people who are constantly descending all the way down on the 45. They're still high as they're descending onto the downwind. The whole idea of being at pattern altitude is that as airplanes are looking out the window for each other, you don't have to look really high and you don't have to look really low. You're looking pretty much in a level band of area as you look from left to center to right. And so people who are coming in high in the pattern, not only are they not following the rules, but they're really making things more dangerous for everyone.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, in terms of the Cirrus kind of flying, virtually the same pattern while descending upon you, one of the things I found, and I do a lot of teaching in Cirrus, is that we end up spending a lot of time talking with pilots who are new to Cirrus about how to manage the traffic pattern so that they don't come up on top of people, even if they are at the correct altitude. Often they are faster than other airplanes, and they can't slow down to match those speeds in many cases. So some of the things that I'm teaching them are, yes, you might fly a wider downwind, you might fly a significantly longer downwind. You might even, if you're staying in the pattern, fly a somewhat longer upwind to create more space between you and the aircraft in front of you. I've got to say, I love having ADS-B in. That's an important tool that we use to manage our spacing. And what I found is that if I have, a mile and a half to 2 miles the whole way around the pattern, we're almost always going to be able to make it work out unless the aircraft in front of us spends a lot of time, rolling out on the runway. So anyway, I'd encourage people to use techniques like that. And if you don't have ADS-B in, please get it, because it's just such an important tool for helping you, manage your safety in the traffic pattern.
Oh, it's huge. I see traffic on the ADS-B in our screens that I would have never seen with my eyes. So pairing that with looking outside it's just such a wonderful safety tool.
Yeah, and I can often see people who are coming to the traffic pattern long before they make their first call. And it's just kind of nice to have a heads up to tell somebody when we're, for example, have just taken off, we haven't turned crosswind yet, that, hey, we might need to look out for this person. Looks like there's someone headed in on the 45. So it's a great early awareness tool.
It is indeed.
So you've read through the new AC. And as you did that, did you find anything new? I did a comparison with the Microsoft Word compare documents, and I saw they added a lot of text, but I wasn't sure I saw anything that was totally new. What did you find as you went through it?
Yeah, the advice is largely the same. There's a significant reorganization. But one thing that I found stressed greatly is how much the FAA discourages a straight-in approach. And I'll say at the very back of the new version of this advisory circular is a page that tries to elicit feedback from readers. And in my second article, I encouraged some folks to go ahead and read the advisory circular and give that feedback. So basically what I did is I shared in my article the feedback that I have already given to the FAA. And one of it was about that, the straight-in approaches. I cringe a little bit to see them discourage the straight-in approach, because I know that as an FAA examiner, I'm constantly doing straight-in approaches with students, and we can't necessarily break off and join the regular pattern, because by ACS standards, we have to get very close to the decision altitude or the minimum descent altitude, very close to the runway. So it's not an option for us to go ahead and join the pattern. So what I wanted to convey is that I don't want pilots to think that because of this new advisory circular that we're not going to have as many straight-in approaches. Some of the advice that I give is that, obviously, if you're doing a straight-in approach, remember you don't have priority. And, it's your job to try to coordinate with the pilots who are already in the pattern to create safe separation. Being able to slow down should be in every instrument pilot's repertoire, right? So we should be able to, add a few knots, take away a few knots for our approach speed to make a seamless entry. And for the pilots who are already established in the pattern, for example, when they turn on a base leg, every time I fly in a pattern, I look straight and final, and I also look on the opposite base leg to make sure that there's no traffic there. So I feel like if pilots who are in the pattern expect to see a straight-in traffic or somebody on the wrong base leg, then I feel like that's an antidote for complacency. Like, I expect to see every time I turn base, there's going to be a plane out there. And, most of the time there isn't. But I feel like that would enhance safety if folks just assumed that there would be. So I just don't want to see the people walk away with the idea that, we're just not going to see straight-in approaches anymore, because in this robust training environment, yes, you will.
Yeah, in terms of people flying the incorrect downwind, I sometimes hear people announce that they're incorrectly on a particular downwind. So it's a relatively small percentage of the time now. Anytime somebody says, hey, they're on the right downwind, you might want to just double check the left downwind, because, people make that mistake from time to time.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing, Max.
So let's just continue with the kind of the straight-in instrument approaches that you were talking about. Obviously, on the check rides, you also have to do a circle to land, in which they break off from the approach and land on some other runway besides the straight-in runway. What does the AC tell us about, which way they should circle and how they should fit themselves into the pattern?
Oh, absolutely. So if you're entering the pattern, part of your pre-approach briefing should be to see what kind of a traffic pattern is established for that airport. And once you start your circling maneuver, you should be circling in the direction that is established for that pattern, unless somehow that a particular circling direction has been established on the approach plate. But unless that's the case, you should be joining the kind of traffic pattern that has been established for that airport.
Well, let's talk about the approach plate. If you're flying in VFR conditions and the approach plate says that you're not allowed to circle to the southwest of the runway, which would be the case at Tracy, where people are coming in on the runway 12 approach, but there's left traffic at Tracy, which means you should be on the southwest side of the airport, and you're in VFR conditions, it's practice, shouldn't you just conform with the traffic pattern, even though the note says don't circle on that side?
You absolutely should, right. So, and if you were actually IFR, then that would be an opportunity, since you've broken out, cancel your IFR flight plan and enter the pattern. There could be a Piper Cub in the pattern who doesn't even have a radio. So it's important to make sure that you join the pattern that's appropriate for the airport.
And I'm happy you brought up the Piper Cub. I was flying at Half Moon Bay Airport, which is a non-towered airport, a year ago, I think, and we had a non-radio Piper Cub in the pattern. And I started making radio announcements for him, and the other pilot in the pattern started making radio announcements for him, and it worked incredibly well. And so I would just encourage everyone, hey, if you have no radio aircraft in the pattern, make their announcements for them.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. That's great.
You also talked in your article about an example that the FAA included in the AC about instrument pilots announcing their position when the example was when they were inbound on a VOR alpha approach. What is it that instrument pilots should be thinking about when they're making those kinds of announcements?
Right. I remember back to when I was a freshly minted private pilot. And, maybe I'm a little slow on the uptake, Max, but I had no idea what an ILS approach was. I had no idea what any of this instrument stuff was. And so, even the example that the FAA gives is something like, on the VOR runway 6 approach, doing the published mist. Well, nobody's going to know what that means. If those freshly minted private pilots have zero idea what you're talking about. And the thing is, even instrument rated pilots have no idea what you're talking about unless they're looking at exactly the same approach plate, right? So here's the thing. Every pilot in the world understands what 5 mile final runway 06 means, right? And then, when you get to the field, every pilot in the world understands going around runway 6, departing to the east, or, what have you. You need to use language that every pilot understands.
Yep, makes total sense. And that's how I try to teach people to make their announcements so that both a student pilot and an instrument pilot would understand, what's going on. It adds a little bit more to the conversation, but not that much more. Let's see, other kinds of things that they talked about in the AC. What about I make an announcement and I don't use my call sign, but I say, hey, a blue Cessna left downwind.
Okay, Max, if I see a Cessna and I can tell that it's blue, I'm too close. The thing is that airplanes all kind of look the same. Most of them are kind of whitish, right? And even a plane that is brightly colored, it's pretty hard to tell exactly what the colors are. So to me, that's pretty useless information. I do like the call sign. That to me is important because that's something that I could also connect with an ADS-B target that I see on my screen. So that helps me paint a mental picture. If, two airplanes are fairly close to each other and I know one of the call signs, then I know which one that is. So, saying your position in terms of, where you are, your altitude, your call sign and aircraft type, citation, I'm looking for something different than I am with a Super Cub, something like that.
I agree. I think those of us with ADS-B in have a huge advantage when we can actually match up the call signs with the people who are making the announcements. And I suspect that a lot of people making these announcements are in aircraft that don't have ADS-B in, and they don't realize that, that's a lot harder to identify them without that call sign. And I will mention that for some ADS-B in displays, there's a separate key you need to push to turn on the call signs. So in many of the aircraft I'm in, we won't see the call signs unless we go in and configure it to see that. So I'd encourage people to figure out how to do that. One thing I think that's lacking in this particular document is that the FAA doesn't exactly explain the whys behind things. And I think that people understand or are more willing to go with rules and regulations if they understand the whys. So, for example, in this case, they don't say why it's important to not say blue Cessna and to use your call sign. Why do you think they feel it's important?
That's a really good point, Max. I wish they would explain the reasons as well, because I think your guess is as good as mine on why they think that's important. I know why I think it's important.
Yeah. And we've just talked about some of this. Well, here's a good example. I hear this all the time. I know you hear it all the time. Any traffic in the area, please advise. Now, they say specifically in the AC that you should not use this under any condition. And that's pretty explicit. You should not use this under any condition. But it doesn't say why. My guess is it certainly takes up unneeded time on the frequency that might be better used for other things. They point out that anybody who hears you announcing your position should be self-announcing. So this is totally redundant to say that. But what are your thoughts on that particular comment? Any traffic in the area, please advise.
Yeah, that's always unfortunate. And, what I try to imagine is, why do people say that? What I imagine is they maybe have just come off maybe an approach frequency, and, they've just been turned over to the local CTAF. So they haven't necessarily been privy to that conversation. But, the nice thing is if you have a couple of NavComs or if you have the ability to monitor, if you're on that instrument approach, say, and you're still with, an approach frequency, you can also be monitoring local traffic. So, that's something that I always do, is to listen to both so that I'm not in the position of being handed over to the local frequency and then having to then quickly paint a picture of where everybody is.
Yes, I like doing that as well. It's nice having a second radio and kind of monitoring what's going on at the destination even before you have switched over there. Well, I have a theory as to why people say, any traffic in the area, please advise. And I suspect that 100 years ago, someone started doing that, and they were a flight instructor, and then their students did it, and they became flight instructors, and their students did it. Sometimes I think things are really slow to change in aviation, and I think it's just passed down from one generation to the next.
Yeah, I feel the same thing with that when people say last call. What information does that give, that this is going to be your last call? That's, to me, is kind of a useless expression. And I feel like that maybe somebody said that a long time ago and it sounded cool or something, and people have done it ever since. So that leaves me scratching my head.
I don't hang out in bars, but is that what they say when it's time for the last round of drinks?
I think so. That's usually past my bedtime, but so I hear, Max.
Yeah, no, I honestly wouldn't know because I just don't hang out in bars. But anyway, one of the things that they talk about in the AC is the difference between the upwind leg and the departure leg. Now, that's something I've started hearing about in recent years, and I got to say, as a student pilot many years ago, I don't remember hearing a distinction between the two. So I'm not sure if one of those got introduced along the way. But talk about what the AC says about the two legs.
Yeah, I found this a little frustrating with the advisory circular. In the appendix, in the first appendix, it gives a diagram of a traffic pattern. And it says that, the departure leg is what you would fly if you were doing a straight out departure from the airport. So it contains, the extended runway center line. The upwind leg is distinct from that, and it's on the opposite side of the runway as the downwind leg. So I like to think of it as about the same distance away from the center line that the downwind leg is. And the verbiage of the advisory circular seems to say that some pilots use those interchangeably. In other words, they'll say they're on the upwind leg when they're really on the departure leg, but it doesn't seem to weigh in on whether they find that acceptable or not. And what I wish they would do is take a stronger stance and call those two separate legs, because if an aircraft, to me, I know when an aircraft is on the upwind, I know where they are, right? If they're on the departure leg, I know where they are. And the upwind leg, is that pilot who descended onto us or started to descend onto us in the traffic pattern at Winchester. That pilot could have entered on, basically he entered on a crosswind, right? If he had entered at pattern altitude on the crosswind, then he could have turned an upwind leg to delay a little bit so that when he turned onto the downwind, he would be at a safer distance to us. So that upwind leg is a really handy leg. I do it all the time. I'll enter on an upwind and I'll check on the 45 traffic and the downward traffic, and then I will make my crosswind turn at a time where I can go seamlessly and safely between two aircraft, or maybe just follow the aircraft in. And so to me, that's a terrific leg, and I wish the FAA would make a stand on that being distinct from the departure leg.
Yeah, that is interesting because they really do not give much explanation at all. And what you just gave is the best explanation I ever heard for the use of the upwind leg. Frankly, it never occurred to me to use it that way. But then I'm at a towered airport. What I notice at our towered airport is that often when we are on the departure leg, they will refer to us as being upwind. And so I think the two get used interchangeably, not only by pilots, but by ATC as well. I guess what I had thought the upwind leg would get used for most often would be somebody who had to do a go around and needed to offset to the left or the right so that they could keep the aircraft below them that's climbing out in sight. And that's something I would highly recommend to people. If you do a go around and there's an aircraft taking off beneath you, definitely offset from the runway so that you can keep that airplane in sight as you start to rejoin the pattern.
Right. And that pilot in that scenario doing the go around is going to be using the upwind leg in exactly the same way. They're going to join the upwind leg, and presumably they still want to land at that airport since they've done a go around, and they'll turn a crosswind at a point where they can seamlessly mesh with traffic that are established on the 45 or on the downwind.
Let's shift gears and talk about lights a little bit. Under collision avoidance, the AC talks about the pilot and command's responsibility to see and avoid, and they say that we should keep our lights and strobes on. What do you do, and what do you recommend for lights and strobes?
So ever since I got LED lighting on my aircraft, I basically stay lit up the entire time. The only exceptions would be when I'm in IMC, I'll turn my strobes off because I know that can be tough, right? And also, obviously, on the ground, I don't want to hurt other people's, vision. So I'll do something different with my lights. But basically, I stay lit up like a Christmas tree when I'm flying because I want to be as obvious as possible.
I totally agree. And I think that's incredibly important in the metro area that I fly in, where you've got so much traffic. I've noticed that I can spot other airplanes at much greater distance if they have their lights on when they're pointed toward me than if they have them turned off. And so that's why I leave mine on virtually all the time. Now, if I'm on a long cross country, we may turn them off in cruise, but boy, I would encourage anybody who's anywhere near an airport, either taking off or landing, just get all of those lights on and help us see you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those LED lights and from what I see are way brighter and they last longer. And years ago when I had an incandescent, I would lose them a lot because, there'd be some vibration in the cowling and I'd lose that filament. And now these lights draw very little and they last a long time. So I just keep them on.
Yeah. And there's at least one study out there that says that birds are more likely to notice your aircraft and start to fly away from you sooner when you've got the lights on. So there's another advantage as well.
Oh, that's good to know. So years ago, I was flying my little Cessna 152 back from East Tennessee, and I was landing at an airport for fuel. And there was a pilot of an extra, which of course is a whole lot faster than a Cessna 152. So I'm on a downwind, and he enters on a crosswind, and he actually comes up right beside me. He's so fast, right? So he comes up right beside me, and he beats me onto the base leg and lands in front of me. So he basically, in the time that I was on downwind to base, he just tucks in right next to me and lands. And I thought it was really kind of funny because basically he was landing there for fuel too. And so he lands and takes up a good part of the runway because he's kind of fast. And I landed real short, took the first taxiway. I actually beat him to the pump, which I thought was kind of, there was some like justice in the world, but I don't think that's related necessarily enough to but it's just sort of some of the bad behavior. But in that case, there was a little justice in the world.
Well, and I had a similar experience in a way, and I still remember it was out at Half Moon Bay, and we were in the traffic pattern. We were on downwind, and somebody called in that they were on the 45, and we could watch them approach to us. And darn if the guy in a Cessna 182 didn't basically end up on our right wing in formation flying with us. He was, we were virtually eyeball to eyeball, wing to wingtip. And I said on the radio, and I said, "Hey, you think maybe you're a little close?" It was an older gentleman who said, "Yeah, okay." And he, widened out. But I just thought, holy cow, when you're coming in on the 45, you should be looking at the aircraft that are in the pattern. And if you're going to be that close, just widen out to follow that particular aircraft or fly a much wider pattern. But I just could not believe that literally this guy was doing formation flying with me.
Right. That's terrible. I've seen too where folks have, say, turned base too early in front of somebody else. They're not creating enough separation. They're just trying to really get on the ground fast. And when they turn final, the plane in front of them lands and doesn't exit on the taxiway in time, so that now it's a go-around situation. It's like if you had just slowed down a little bit, maybe extended your downwind just a little bit, then, you wouldn't have had to go around. So sometimes there's that Zen expression that I like so much. In order to get someplace more quickly, go more slowly. And I think we could all benefit from that kind of advice. Sometimes the most efficient thing to do is just to slow down a little bit.
And I think that fits in with something that I see occasionally, and that is pilots who kind of whine that they had to go around because they were so close behind the airplane in front of them. I think that pilots, some of them don't understand, especially when you're in a towered airport. The tower is responsible for sequence, but the pilot is responsible for separation. And I've seen this at towered airports where the pilot complains about having to go around when it was totally their fault. They just got right up on top of the airplane in front of them, yet somehow they thought that it was the fault of the pilot in front of them or the tower. So all I can say is, yeah, slow down. Pilots, you're responsible for creating that space between you and the airplane in front of you.
Oh, and it's so easy to do it. You can extend your downwind just a little bit. You can slow down just a little bit. You can square off your base turn a bit. There are lots of techniques that you can use to just create a little more space, and then you don't go around. Even though, shoot, Max, we all like to fly. What's a go around?
Yeah, exactly. It's good practice, good experience.
Yeah,
well, Catherine,
absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us again here today. Where do people find out more about you and your flight school?
Sure. Yeah. My web address is aceaerobaticschool.com. I write the Flying Smart column for AOPA pilots. So if you get that magazine, you get to, see what I have to say monthly, which is a lot of fun for me.
Totally fun. Hey, thanks so much for joining us here. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise. Thanks, Max.
And my thanks to Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro for joining us again here today. You can find out more about her and her aerobatic school at aceaerobaticschool.com, and you can find more of her work in the pages of AOPA Pilot Magazine. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the encounter at the Watsonville Airport last week. The Cessna that was coming in on the long straight-in final decided to make a 360 at about 1.8 miles from the airport. And at that point, that aircraft was still doing 112 knots. The aircraft preceding it was just about over the threshold at that point in time. So there was reasonably good separation. Ironically, if the Cessna had been a little bit slower, something closer to final approach speed, ironically, had that Cessna that was doing the long straight-in final just slowed up, there probably would have been plenty of room to land without having to do the 360. Now, this is something that I see commonly with people that I fly with who are doing long straight-in approaches. They tend to stay fast a little bit too long, and they also tend to be a little bit high. And I think that's because I've never really seen a flight instructor teach how to do a long straight-in final. It seems like it's simple. For example, coming into Palo Alto, I always give people a target. I tell them that when they cross the amphitheater, which is about 2.5 miles from the runway, they ought to be 1,000 feet and slowed up for flap speed. And if they do that, they're going to make the runway every time. Often, instead, I don't see them slow up until just about the point where they're established on the visual glide slope. And at that point, when they add flaps and they're fast, they end up climbing above the glide slope and then have to chop power so that they can get back down on the glide slope. As always, if you have any feedback on this episode or any comments for the show, feel free to go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact on the top of the page to send me an email. And if you'd like to support the show, it's really easy. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down. You can always